I'll just do some announcements and introduce you, and then you can come on up. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for coming tonight. We're going to go ahead and get started with a few announcements. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the York County History Center's YouTube channel later. On Friday, October 4th, we'll have First Friday with spooky walking tours. Those will be at half-hour intervals from 6, 6:30, 7, and 7:30. On October 12th, that's a Saturday, the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society will be meeting at the Pennsylvania State Archives for a tour at 2:15. October 16th, we'll have Civil War Roundtable, where Tyrone and Sue Kornbauer will present In Camp and Field, 1861 to 1865, the American Civil War through the lenses of the stereopticon. And on October 20th, from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., we'll have our 50th annual Oyster Festival, and that will be over at the Colonial Complex. And for updates and more information about any of these programs, please visit our website at yorkhistorycenter.org. And our speaker tonight is Major Donald Androsky, who served in the Army from 1955 to 1975, in which he did 3 tours in Vietnam. So please welcome Mr. Androsky.
Thank you. By way of introduction, I want to tell a story. I'm Major Androsky, but the Androsky I'm going to talk about first is my father. He was a sergeant in the 6th Field Artillery, and this is 1938. In 1938, there was a sesquicentennial. I have difficulty saying that, but it means 75th year of the memorial of the Civil War. And the 6th Field Artillery, the unit that my father was in, was selected to go to Gettysburg when they lit the eternal flame. President FDR was going to light the flame on Reynolds Avenue. And the 6th Field Artillery was going to do a engagement. They were going to actually go into battery in a demonstration. Now, they were stationed at a place called Fort Hoyle, Maryland. And Fort Hoyle, Maryland, if not many of you are familiar with that, is now the Army Chemical Center, or Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, not too far south of here. And they marched from Fort Hoyle to Gettysburg. It took them 2.5 days or 3 days, I think it was. Now, all of the officers rode horses, and the NCOs rode horses. My father was a sergeant at the time. He was a gunnery sergeant in the 6th Field Artillery, and they had French 75s. And a French 75 at that time was considered the best direct artillery weapon in the world. And it earned its reputation in the First World War. The 6th Field Artillery also earned its reputation in the First World War. They fired the first shot of the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I, first artillery shot. So they marched to Gettysburg, and they get to Gettysburg, and my dad tells the story that while they were there, they had a lot of fellows that were still living. Now, they were boys in the war. They might have been drummers, they might have been flag bearers, they might have been orderlies, but they were there at Gettysburg in gurneys. Some of them were in wheelchairs. And when the 6th Field Artillery went into battery, they all applauded and jumped up like it was a big event in their life. So now the 6th Field Artillery has to come back, and they march back. And the first day that they left, now you know the battle was from the 3rd of July until the 5th of July. And they left on the 5th of July to come back to Edgewood Arsenal, or Fort Hoyle as it was called at that time. And they bivouacked the first night. And where they bivouacked, they unlimbered the horses and set up their area. And one of the fellows found out that there was a farm nearby and had moonshine. So as you might expect, they got some moonshine, and they drank the moonshine. And the result of it was, the next day, on the 6th of July, my dad was inebriated. But they got him up on his horse, and they limbered up the caissons, and they started marching back. Now the horse was his horse, and it was named Tony. That was my father's first name, Tony. The horse was trained to walk, not trot, not gallop. You know, it's trained to walk when you're in formations. But if the rider passes out, the horse tends to trot. And the horse trotted up the line, past the battery commander, and the battery commander leaned over to the guidon bearer, it was a fellow by the name of Chick Hughes, and said, "Who was that just trotted past?" And the guy said, "That's Sergeant Androsky." He said, "Well, go tell Corporal Androsky to dismount." And he did, and he had to walk all the way back to Edgewood Arsenal. Now, when he got back on the 8th of May. That's when the unit assembled back at Fort Hoyle.
July.
Now, he's a corporal, right? Or 8th of July, I'm sorry. And the Red Cross sends a message, because my mother at that time, on the 8th of July, gave birth to me. And the Red Cross sent a message to the battery commander. His name was, I can't remember his name, it'll come to me. He said, "Get Androsky to come in here." And the first sergeant got a runner down, and Androsky shows up. And he said, "I just got a message from the Red Cross that your wife gave birth to a baby boy. And I'm going to relent and make you back." So he made him back to a buck sergeant. And that was my first introduction to the Army, July 8th, 1938. That's 86 years ago. I followed my dad around, and our family did, my father and my 2 siblings and my mom. In the 40s, they knew that we were going to go to war, so they broke out all the sergeants, all the cadre, and sent them all over the country as trainers. And my dad was up and down the eastern seaboard. He went from South Carolina to North Carolina, Georgia, and then eventually in 1943 he went overseas to New Guinea and then the Philippines. But we followed my father around from the time I was born till I was 17 years old. I went to 13 different schools and didn't graduate. I elected when I was 17 years old to go in the Army, and he didn't want me to go in the Army. At that time he had 25 years in the service. He was a master sergeant. But I went in the Army because I was smarter than school. And I enlisted, and the guy who recruited me was the guidon bearer, who at that time was a master sergeant recruiter in Maryland. The same guy that told the battery commander, "That's Androsky that went past us." I want to tell you the story, and I have a lot of stories. I want to hark back to last month. Was my first time here, and it was a Marine gave a talk about the last day, and it was an excellent talk. Yeah. But he said that he had no memory of the time he was in Vietnam. I was there 3 times, and I got a lot of memories and a lot of stories. Some of them are the banal stuff, you know, that it's funny, that all of us veterans would understand and laugh at. Some blood and guts, but not a whole lot of it, because in a 20-year career, I served 3 years in combat. I served 17 years doing other things, a lot of other things. And people don't realize that when they talk to a career soldier, they think, well, he's been dodging bullets for 20 years. That generally doesn't happen. When I was enlisted, I went to Fort Jackson. And I don't know if any of you fellows have been to Fort Jackson in August. It's hot. It's extremely hot. Now, I went in the Army with a good friend of mine. I talked him into going in the Army. And he knew that I was an Army brat. He knew that my dad was a sergeant in the Army. So he assumed that I knew something about the Army, something that he didn't know, right? That was a bad assumption on his part, which he'll learn later on. So we go to Fort Jackson, and that's where you would draw your initial issue. I'm 17 years old. We go in. This fellow's name was Dan Whitener. Dan and I go in, and they assembled us in formation, and they gave us all a brand new $5 bill called the Flying Five. Are you familiar with that? The Flying Five they gave to you, and then they put you in a formation, and you went to the barbershop, got your hair cut. That came out of the $5. Then you went to the PX, and you bought all your toilet articles. Now, I had toilet articles, at least I knew that much when I went to service, but a lot of those fellows, those USs, the draftees, and some of the volunteers, they didn't have 2 nickels, and they had no toilet articles. And you had to have the certain toilet articles, those of you who remember, to put in your foot locker, the shaving brush, shaving cream, razor, toothbrush, tooth powder. You bought all that. And when you were done, you had about $1.30 left. And you were able to keep that and go to the PX. The next day, we're still in civilian clothes because we hadn't drawn our initial issue, but we had haircuts, real haircuts, no hair. And it's a hot day, and they have a formation, and this corporal who was in charge of us all, he said, I need 2 volunteers to be firemen. Now right away the light bulb goes off in my head. A fireman on a military post, they don't do anything. They sit and polish the truck, that's it. Because there's no fires. You're not allowed to have fires on a post. So I figured, this is good, right? I'll volunteer. So I nudged my buddy Dan and I said, we're volunteering to be firemen. So we go out of the formation, the rest of them go on police call or whatever detail they had. And the corporal says, go to the supply room and pick up a wheelbarrow. And I'm thinking, a wheelbarrow? What the hell would firemen have to do with a wheelbarrow? Now, if those of you who are my age would remember, we were in World War II barracks at that time. And those barracks were fueled by big giant boilers that burned coal. Right next to them were little small boilers, about this big, which was the hot water heater. That kept the water hot in the barracks. It's August. It's probably 96 degrees. They suspended training that day because it was so hot that people could not train well. They would pass out. The barracks right next to where I was at was occupied by all brand new second lieutenants who had come there for their IOBC, Infantry Officer Basic Training. And they were in the barracks, stripped down into their shorts, trying to keep cool because they suspended training. And they had these big fans in there. I go and get the wheelbarrow and come back, and I'm thinking, what am I going to do with this thing? Well, the wheelbarrow is full of fatwood, kindling. And the corporal says, what you're to do is you're to go to each one of these barracks and light the boilers. Okay, so I didn't realize that the boiler, the big boiler, was not the boiler he was talking about. He was talking about the little boiler that you put fire in for the hot water. So Dan and I go down and we light the little boiler and we light the big boiler, which the fire had already been laid, cold. And again, I have to tell you that when those boilers were fired up, they would blow coal dust throughout. So when you would fire them up in the wintertime, nobody stayed in the barracks. They would just light them up until the coal dust blew out. And then the heat came on. Well, in August, when that coal dust came out, it formed black circles around those lieutenants' faces and their eyes, and they came out of those barracks like they were on fire in their shorts. Now, we were already to the 3rd barracks when that happened. And the corporal finally stopped us, and said, you're done, you're finished. relieved us of being firemen. But that wasn't the end. Because we didn't do a good job, he said, I'll tell you what, he said, after chow this evening, you're going to go to the administrative building and wax the floor. You and Dan, your buddy. That was our punishment for what we had done. So we go to chow, and we come back, and we go to the administrative building, and I had never operated a buffer before in my life, but I remember in school seeing a custodian moving a buffer around. And custodians weren't scientists. If they could do it, I could do it, right? And these were commercial buffers, not little buffers. They were gigantic things. So we waxed the floor, and there were a whole set of desks on one side and a whole set of desks on the other side, and then this aisleway. And these desks had all the information for all the recruits that were coming in, you know, the inboxes there and outboxes and stuff. And Dan said, do you know how to operate that buffer? And I said, no. I said, well, what's so difficult about it, you know? I mean, it just goes like that. I've seen them do it in high school. Now, this buffer had a lock on it. And with your right hand, when you would grab it, you could lock it. And he plugged it in, and I grabbed it and locked it, not on purpose, I didn't realize that, and the buffer took off. You can't horse the buffer. The buffer is king. And it went round, down that aisleway and hit every one of those desks and knocked all the inboxes off and all the papers around them. That was my introduction to the Army. And Dan still believed that I knew something about the military. I left there and went to Fort Knox and recruited into the 3rd Armored Division, which was a gyroscope unit, and was going to go to Germany. I spent the next 20 years in the military. I went to a lot of places. I went to Germany with the 3rd Armored Division, and I spent 3 years there. And it was kind of a checkered 3 years. I was a good soldier. I was a damn good soldier, but I was no good when it came to going off post. I would climb the fence, I would miss bed check, and sometimes I was drunk and disorderly. So I signed the company punishment book so many times that they thought I was the author of the company punishment book. I had several Article 15s, but I survived that 3 years. And I got out, and I had no intention of staying in the Army. I got out in 1958, and there was a recession in Maryland at the time. And it was very difficult to get a decent job. And I put in for as many jobs as I could. Nothing happened. So I decided I'd go back in. And I re-enlisted, and guess who re-enlisted me? Chick Hughes, the guidon bearer that recruited me for my first assignment. He re-enlisted me. When he re-enlisted me, he sent me to Edgewood Arsenal. My dad was still in the Army. He was master sergeant. He was the motor sergeant for the labs. And when I got there, I mean, I had combat infantry training, and I was a scout, armor intelligence specialist, but there was none of that there. This was all, they called them SPPs. They were fellows that were graduated from college, and they would go, they all had degrees in chemical warfare, or not chemical warfare, but chemicals, and they were scientists. And they had no rank. They were called SPPs, and they would go to the labs and work in the labs. So there was nothing there for me, so they made me a driver. And I drove for a guy called Pee Wee Falens. He was a full colonel and later on became a general officer at the Army Chemical Center. And what I would do is I would drive from Edgewood Arsenal to Washington and take some of the people there who were working on experiments. For example, one of them was nerve gas. This is in the back of a 1957 Chevy. That was the staff car that I drove. they put a box in there with 2 rabbits in it, and they had a canister of nerve gas. If you can imagine that. I didn't know that. And I drove them in, and there was a couple of colonels that they did a demonstration, and they would put 1 drop on the ear of the rabbit, dead instantly. I would take films in of all the experiments that they did, and take them into Kodak and sit there and wait for them to be developed. And one day, they asked me to go in and pick up some people at Washington International. There were some scientists coming in. So I went to pick them up, but before I picked them up, I had a captain that was going to go with me. Normally I'd go by myself. And the captain sat up front and he said, I'm going to go with you. We're going to go in and pick up these scientists. So we go in and we pick up these fellows, and they get in the back seat of the sedan. And I'm a corporal, by the way, at this time. And I'm driving back to Edgewood, and the captain is talking to these people, and in German. And he says to me, he says, do you know where, I won't tell you the name of the place, but it was a liquor distributor. Do you know where that is? And I said, yeah, I know where it is. I pass it all the time. He said, well, take me there. So I take the sedan there, and he gets out, and he goes in, and he comes back with a box full of liquor, and puts it in the car, and we go back to Edgewood Arsenal, to the officers club, and we drop off these scientists. And he goes in, and then he comes out, the captain comes out a little bit later, and he said, you know who that was? And I said, I have no idea. He said, one of them is Werner von Braun. But he knew where this liquor store was. He knew that, and he knew that he could get the special kind of liquor that he wanted. And that's something that you don't encounter very often, you know. I stayed there at Edgewood for about 9 months, but I was really ill-assigned. I shouldn't have been there. I should have been with a combat unit, which is where I belong. And there's another story. I won't tell you that story right now, but between my father and the sergeant major at the post, they decided that I would go on the first levy that came down. And the first levy was to the 25th Infantry Division in Hawaii. And they put me on that levy, and I shipped out. My recommendation to you is, if you are ever going to be assigned with your father, turn it down. It's a bad deal. Rough time. I went from there to the 25th Infantry Division. I was with the reconnaissance unit and made sergeant. Went to the NCO Academy, graduated, and then got talked into going to OCS. And that's how I began my career as an officer. I was commissioned in 1962. I was stationed at Fort Meade. I stayed at Fort Meade for, I guess, 2.5 years, and then I was a company commander of a training company in Fort Polk, Louisiana. I was there exactly 1 year and left there and went through my first tour in Vietnam, which was in I Corps, where you were with the AmeriCal. I was there with the 1st ARVN Division. I was an advisor to the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Brigade, 1st ARVN Division, and then the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Brigade, 1st ARVN Division. We operated with the Marines. The Marines had just come into country and had moved from Da Nang to Dong Ha, and they were on their way to Khe Sanh. And before they got to Khe Sanh, I left one unit and went to the other unit, which is in a place called Long Bay. And Long Bay was as far north and as far west as you could go in Vietnam. You're probably aware of that. And we were the security for Khe Sanh. The Marines were not at Khe Sanh at that time. There was a Special Forces outfit there and some Nung, which were mercenaries, Chinese mercenaries. And I provided security from Laos, Route 9, all the way to Khe Sanh. We supplied 81 millimeter ammunition to the Royal Lao. Not the Pathet Lao, they were the communists, this is the Royal Lao. And I finished that tour, came back, went to the career course for infantry officers. And I stayed there for 9 months and went right back in 1968 to the 4th Infantry Division as a company commander of a rifle company. I stayed with that rifle company for 7 months and basically was promoted out of it. I made major and went to the 1st of the 8th, Bullets, 1st of the 8th Battalion as the executive officer, and then eventually as a task force commander for Operation Wayne Gray.
Uh-oh.
This makes it look better, doesn't it?
Just was too quiet.
I finished that assignment. That was my second tour. I came back and went to Buffalo, New York, where I was an advisor to the 98th Division, which was an infantry division, reserve. And I advised them in 4 or 5 different areas. Stayed with them until my 3rd tour, and that was in 72 and 73. I went back, and this time I was in 4 Corps. So I started in I Corps my first tour, 2 Corps for my second tour, skipped 3 Corps, and went down to 4 Corps in the swamps. Now at that time, in 72 and 73, they were doing the Paris Peace Accords, if you remember. And they were arguing over the size of the table and all that crap. But our job was to retrograde as much of the sensitive equipment as we could back to the United States. Because it was a foregone conclusion in the military, they were going to lose. And we didn't want to lose all those sensitive pieces of equipment. In the process of doing that, I also did what they called, for 6 months, I flew first lights, last lights, and 6-packs. I spent a lot of time in helicopters. The first light was to go up to see if they were going to fire any rockets. You could spot them. Last light, same thing, you'd see them in the evening. And the 6-pack was put 2 rocket ships up top, 2 Loaches on the bottom. I flew the CNC in the middle, and a ready reaction force at the main active. And we would run the Loaches down, and they just simply couldn't resist it. They would have to fire at those Loaches. And that's not easy to hit. And once they fired, we rolled the big boys down. And we did that for 6 months until that tour was over with. I returned in 73, went to Fort Dix, became the assistant to the deputy installation commander, and eventually retired in 1975. 37 years of glorious time. Best time of my entire life. I'm 86 years old right now, and I still think about those days. That's my tour. I have a lot of stories to tell. Unfortunately for you boys, it's too late. I don't want to tell them in a short period of time. But I'll leave my name and number here, and you can call me. I'll stop by and tell you a few. Thank you very much. What's the time? Half hour.
Yeah, about half hour.
Are you open for questions?
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
represent speakers for